Pleasant morning to everyone. Please open your Bibles with me in the book of Genesis, chapter 8. Genesis chapter 8, beginning with verse 13, up to verse 1 of chapter 9. Genesis chapter 8, verse 13, up to chapter 9, verse 1. I will read from the New American Standard Bible. Now it came about in the 601st year, in the first month, and on the first of the month, the water was dried up from the earth. Then Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the surface of the ground was dried up. In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds, animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth, went out by their families from the ark. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took off every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma. And the Lord said to himself, "I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest and cold and heat and summer and winter and day and night shall not cease." And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." May the good Lord bless the reading of His word. We have a Filipino culture that whenever we have a celebration in our home, we tend to reserve and preserve the best for some special guest. I remember when I was still a little boy, I stayed with my grandmother. And every time we had a party in the house, she would often tell us before the party begins, "Please do not touch the leche flan inside the fridge. Please do not touch the endulzao inside the fridge, because that is preserved for these special guests." So nobody would touch whatever she instructed us not to touch. We would abide with her. She decides which one to preserve, which one to let go. And so the earlier visitors would come, she would let go of those food, which I think she considered not so special. She preserved those she thought that were very special for the special guest. She decides which to preserve, which one to let go. And as I was looking at the fridge, sometimes I would ask myself, which should be preserved? Which should be let go? And that exact same idea, I believe, if we look at the text that we read, it was the story of the survivors of the flood that happened and all over the ground in those days. And if you look at those individuals that were preserved, I ask myself, why did God choose these individuals that He preserved? Were there people who deserved to be preserved that were not preserved? After all, who deserved to be preserved in those days? Because if you go back to the previous chapters, for us to have a better understanding of chapter 8 and the text that we read, I think we need to go back as early as chapter 6 for us to see what was happening on earth back then. Verses 1 to 4 of chapter 6 goes like this. "Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. And the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. And the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old and men of renown. When I read this passage, I asked the question, who is this son of God, or who were these sons of God? I read different scholars' writings, and I found out that there were three possible interpretations to this line, sons of God here. Some people would say that these sons of God are pertaining to angels. However, there could be a big question to that perception of the passage, because when you go to the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, even in the book of Revelation, would tell us that when we someday would go to heaven, we will be like angels, not marrying each to the other. Meaning to say, they would not be paired between a male and a female. No pairing in heaven, as expressed in the New Testament text. So are these angels? Besides, there are no other portions in the scriptures that the sons of God term was used to pertain to angels. Some people would say these are not angels, but these were royalties. Because in those days, if you happen to be a leader in the society, if you belong to a royal family, if you happen to be a great warrior, sometimes they were attributed or they were called as sons of God. But the context would not show clearly about that matter. Scholars like Colin Berger, Kenneth Barker, and Constable, they all agreed that these terms sons of God here are pertaining to the descendants of Seth. And these were godly men, individuals who feared the Lord. But the problem was they saw daughters of men, they saw daughters of people who were ungodly. And they intermarried with these individuals. And because of that, out of that intermarriage, they were also contaminated spiritually. And then their morality also went down along with the spouses that they have who were ungodly. So these were godly men who married ungodly women and became contaminated with their spirituality, with their kind of worship, with the gods that they believe, until they also went down morally and spiritually with these women that they married with. And that happened. And wickedness grew further and further if you look at the text. So if that is the background of the flood, if that was the background of the preservation that God showed in the life of Noah and his family, after all, who would be deserving? Who deserved to be preserved? If you look at this morality of these people, the spirituality of these individuals, nobody who deserved to be preserved after all. Proceed to verse 5 of chapter 6. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of men was great on earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Who deserved to be preserved if the heart of men are evil continually? Meaning to say, not a moment that they have thought of good things, but they were thinking of evil things. In verse 6, the Lord was sorry that he had made man on earth. Have you imagined you created something and yet you regretted because of how it went to? The result of your creation, supposedly there to live their lives according to your purpose, your intention, and yet what happened next was they deviated from your will, they delved into wickedness, they swam in the sea of unrighteousness. Who deserve to be preserved if that's the case? In fact, God continued with his statement, I am sorry that I have made them, in verse 7 of chapter 6. Proceed to verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. The holy God who made human beings with the ability and capacity to do what is good and to choose what is good, and to reject evil supposedly, did not follow his will. If that's the case of those people living on earth before the flood, who deserved to be preserved? And God continued with his statement in verse 13. For the earth, again, he said this line, was filled with violence. And in verse 17, he said, something will happen. Something will come upon earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on earth shall perish. Who deserved to be preserved if God intended to destroy almost everything? The answer to that question, who deserved to be preserved, there is no one except Noah. The passage also clearly tells us that he said to Noah, but I will establish my covenant with you. And as I was looking at the context and the passage itself that we read, I was fascinated that the Bible does not mention that the wife of Noah deserved to be preserved. The Bible does not mention also that the sons of Noah and their wives deserved to be preserved. The text does not say that. Instead, the passage from chapter 6, 7, and 8 clearly tells us and repeatedly mentions that Noah was instructed by God to get inside the ark with his wife, with his sons, and with his sons' wives. Repeatedly. And after they were already on the dry land, Noah was instructed by God, you go out of the ark with your sons, with your with your wife, with your sons, and with your sons' wives. Repeatedly mentioned. And I asked the question, why does the writer need to repeat this? And I realized that nobody else deserves that preservation except Noah himself. But since those people belong to his family, then they had to be with him so that they also will experience God's preservation. Who deserve to be preserved? No one else. Only Noah. They were there in the ark. They experienced God's preservation. They experienced God's provision. They experienced God's grace. That's why they needed to stay with someone whom God found favor, found that he was righteous in his eyes. Was Noah living a perfect life? No. Was he living a life without sin, even a single one? I believe he did not have that kind of life. But when the passage tells us that God found favor in the life of Noah, or Noah found favor in the eyes of God, he was standing in contrast to the realities happening in the lives of the individuals surrounding him. Wickedness was all over the world. Individuals' heart was contaminated by sin. That was the situation. So if you ask the question, who deserved to be preserved, there is no one else except Noah. This is a reality that did not only happen in those times. This is a reality that is relevant and real even in our time today. So if we would ask the question, look at our society and ask the question, who deserve to be preserved? How can one person today deserve to be preserved if we have distorted many designs of God? How can we call ourselves deserving to be preserved if our thoughts are filled with malice? How can we be deserving to be preserved if we slander each other? Nobody deserves to be preserved. Every one of us should be destroyed. But is that a reality that happened to all of us today? It is not. Why are you still here? Why are we still gathering? Why do we have a blessed hope? Why are we looking forward about the future that we will be all redeemed? Why? Because despite the fact that there is no one who deserves to be preserved, God comes in grace that instead of putting in us the punishment that we deserve, He preserved us and let go of His Son so that you and I will be preserved until eternity. Who deserved to be preserved? There is no one. But God came to preserve you. You know what? From time to time, I learned to check about expiration date about in every product that I buy. Before, I do not do that. When I go to the grocery store, I just pick some stuff, put it in the basket, and sometimes look at the price. But blessed are men who have a meticulous spouse, who would check every detail of the product before they will buy it. So my wife would check the dates, expiration date, the price, compare it with other products. And it takes time. And sometimes I don't like it because it takes time. But there is a wisdom behind. One time, we bought something. We were in Manila back then. And we bought something. I was the one who got the product from the shelf. Put it in the basket. She did not check it anymore, I think, because she didn't notice that I placed something in the basket. And so it was then there at the counter. She paid for it, checked everything, and she wondered why there is something that she didn't know about that's there in the basket and it's there at the receipt. And so she just let it pass and we went home. When we were there home already, I think we buy a spread, sandwich spread. And she checked on the expiration date and it was already expired. When a product is expired, what does it deserve? Does it deserve to be eaten? Does that deserve to be preserved? No. The only thing that it deserves is the trash bin. You throw it away because it's expired. And I think that pictures every one of us. We are expired already. We are no longer pleasant in the eyes of God. We are already doomed. We are supposed to be thrown away to the trash bin. But God did not do that. Instead, He came and cleansed every one of you, and including myself, so that we will be preserved for eternity. That is why when you look at the text, God told Noah, Noah, you are there already in the dark, in the dry place. Go out with your wife, with your sons, and with your sons' wives. And they went out. And when they were already out there, in response to that preservation that God showed to Noah and his family, the only appropriate response was worship. And so he got some stones, piled it one up to the other. And then when it became into an altar already, he consecrated it and then offered clean animals before God. And chapter 8, verse 20, tells us about that account. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma. When that line is mentioned, the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, meaning to say God was accepting the sacrifice that they were offering. That sacrifice was offered out of gratitude, a response of worship to the preservation that God has done in Noah's life and more than anything else, his family's life, who were not deserving and yet they were preserved because God has shown mercy and favor in the eyes of Noah. They didn't deserve to be preserved, but they were preserved. You and I, we do not deserve to be preserved. But since that time when Christ extended His both hands on the cross and said to humankind, I love you this much and I would come in grace, showing to you my love, when you put your faith on Him, it is then that the preservation of God for you until eternity has taken its effectivity. You are preserved by God to eternity. And not only that, the beauty of this text that we read. Chapter 9, verse 1, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. After they experienced God's preservation, God is so really gracious. Why did I say that? This line in chapter 9, verse 1 was already mentioned by God, not to Noah and his family before, many years ago. Let's go back to chapter 1, verse 28 of Genesis. God said these exact words to the first human beings, and God blessed them, to Adam and Eve, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. This same statement, same line, word for word, were given to Adam and Eve. God intended these two individuals to live their lives according to His will and purpose, and yet they failed. The next generation failed. The next generation failed. The next generation succumbed into sin. The next generation failed again until the generation of Noah. And yet when Noah and his family were preserved by God at the end of it, God told them, fill, multiply, fill, and subdue the earth. The same line given to Adam and Eve. And what does this mean? This means that God is not only preserving His people, but God reinstates when someone commits mistake. Especially in our time today, that you and I already experience the grace of Jesus Christ. Yes, you may fail at times. You may lie sometimes to your parents. You may sometimes twist something and present it as a fact, as a truth. You may malign somebody. You may think of negative thoughts about somebody else in your office. You may want somebody to die because that person hurt you. And yet what God is telling here is that I have preserved you, my child. Even if you failed me already, even if you sinned before me already, what I'm telling you right now is that I am here by grace. I respond to you. I give to you again that command. Fill and subdue the earth. I am reinstating you. You may be discouraged because you have said to the Lord, Lord, over and over again, I have committed this mistake. But every time you come to Him and utter those mistakes that you have said, He would just tell you, I have paid for that in the cross already. What I want you to do now is go and sin no more. Because I am reinstating you to that level of condition which I have given you by grace on the cross. You have lied. God has forgiven you. Go and sin no more. You have committed adultery. God has forgiven you. Go and sin no more. You have made a discrepancy or intentionally made some discrepancy in your account so that you can get more. God has forgiven you. Go and sin no more. Because what God does is that He responds in grace and He reinstates those who would come to Him. It is my prayer that as you go out of this house of worship, you may have come here with those sins in your heart and mind and thinking about the mistakes you have committed, the failure you have done. I want you to go out of this house of worship. You are a clean slate again. Because Jesus is telling every one of us, I have paid for that already at the cross. And I am reinstating you to be the influence in your office. I am reinstating you to be an influence among your students. I am reinstating you to share the gospel to your office mates. I am reinstating you to become a powerful influence in your community. I am reinstating you to propagate the character of a believer. I am reinstating you to express the grace that I have. I am reinstating you on that level, on that capacity that I have given you. Because God does not only preserve, but He reinstates. So when we ask the question, who deserved to be preserved? Nobody. But God preserves us by His grace and reinstates us and empowers us and releases us with the presence and power of the Spirit so that you and I can make a difference wherever He may have placed us in. God bless you all and good morning.